Alrighty, gentlemen, so we're going to dive into Daniel 6 here. Finally. I've been thinking we're on Daniel 6 for like the last week now. We're finally there. Alright, so this is the infamous Daniel in the Lion's Den chapter. So, picking it up at verse 1. It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 high officials, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps could give account, so that the king might suffer no loss. So we see here, Nebuchadnezzar's son fell to the prophecy of Daniel. Like Daniel prophesied he would fall to the Medo-Persian Empire, which is exactly what happened. And then Darius, who was the head of the Medo-Persian Empire, took control of Babylon and saw it fit to immediately appoint Daniel as his right-hand man, essentially. Like, he saw it fit, like, he appointed 120 satraps, so essentially 120 politicians to rule over his kingdom, and he put Daniel in charge of over all of them. And some commentators point out that it might be because Daniel had prophesied Belshazzar's fall to Darius's empire, and because of that, he had a high regard for him, and because his reputation preceded him, he had a high regard for him. And at this point, Daniel's about 80 to 90 years old. He's no spring chicken at this point. He is up there. So then this Daniel became distinguished above all other high officials and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him. And the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. Then the high officials and the satraps sought to find a ground for complaint against Daniel with regard to the kingdom, but they could find no ground for a complaint or any fault, because he was faithful, and no error or fault was found in him. Then the men said, "We shall not find any ground for complaint against this Daniel unless we find it in connection with the laws of his God." Then these officials and satraps came by agreement to the king and said to him, "O King Darius, live forever. All the high officials of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors and the governors are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into a den of lions. Now, O king, establish this injunction and sign the document so that it cannot be changed, according to the laws of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked." Therefore, King Darius signed the document and injunction. So, pretty straightforward. They did not like Daniel. They did not like what he stood for, what he represented. They wanted him gone. They realized because he had outstanding integrity, they could bring no charge against him. So they had to fabricate one. They had to literally create a law to catch him up in it so they could persecute him, so they could try to cause his demise. So they knew that, again, integrity. And we see this, right? If somebody has integrity, what does the world love to do? Attack. They love to attack that person, find the flaw, find the crack, apply pressure, cause the fracture that leads to a crumble. That's what they love to do.
It's like jealousy.
Yeah, exactly. It is jealousy. That's exactly what it is, and that's a sin. Envy. Who is this old Jew, this exiled, Hebrew? Who is he to be put at the head of this kingdom, to be in charge of me? That's rebellion. They didn't like it, and we can all, I think, relate to that to some degree. I think I know I fall to this sometimes. I used to more. God recently really worked on me and really sanctified me in this regard of submission to powers put over me. But we all have a tendency to rebel, especially as Americans. I mean, that's ingrained in our cultural DNA, right? Our nation was founded on rebellion and of bucking of an authority that was over us. You know, the tax that caused the Revolutionary War was, I think, like less than 3%. Less than 3%. I think it might have been like 1 point something percent. Don't quote me on that. I know for sure it was less than 3%. And we literally fought a war for independence over that. We pay like 30% just in income tax, most people, today. Not to mention the gas tax whenever you put fuel in your car, death tax, funeral tax, estate tax, sales tax, luxury tax. I mean, we can go on. Pennsylvania has a lot of taxes that you don't realize you pay.
Reading's local income tax.
Yeah.
1.5, while the rest of the county is only 1.
Yeah, local income tax, vehicle registration, vehicle state inspection and emissions. We're one of the only states with both of those on an annual basis. That's a tax stamp on your windshield. That's what that is. I used to be a mechanic. I used to do inspections. Trust me, they don't take it too seriously. I mean, I've been in states like California that are heavily overregulated, and they don't even do a safety inspection there. They do smog just for the environment because they actually legitimately do have a smog problem that was killing people. So I get that in California, but yeah. So anyway, it is built into our, before I digress too much ranting on taxes, but it is built into us as Americans especially to buck authority. I mean, look, we just had presidents change, right? And they could not be more, well, they could be more polar opposite because the one that left really wasn't ultra conservative, whereas the one that came in is pretty ultra liberal. However, they're fairly opposite ideologies. Yet you see just as much rebellion and bucking of both of them. Even groups that supported the current one and were against the old one are now against the new one. Simply because they want to buck authority. They don't want it. And again, as Americans, we are extremely prone to this, more so than other people. But at the same time, there are some solid merits to that are not sinful. That's a whole nother conversation for a whole nother book of the Bible, though. Specifically in Romans, which is probably what I'm preaching on next Tuesday, so stop in at chapel if you want to hear more about that one. So picking up here, though. So there it is. There's authority. They don't like it. They don't want it. They try to find fault with him. He has integrity. And as we see today, nothing's changed. Nothing new under the sun, as we're told in Ecclesiastes by Solomon. They tried to find fault. They couldn't, so they made a law that they knew would catch him up. They intentionally made a law that would cause him to commit a crime and be executed. Picking up at verse 10. When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had previously done. He heard that this law was passed, and what did he do? Break it. And prayed. So here comes an important doctrine of Christendom. This is an important thing that spans all spectrums, all denominations. We are to submit to authorities unless that authority commands us to go against God. And at that point, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Give to Caesar what is Caesar's in regard to taxes. Yes, and give to God what is God's. Right? At that point, you still see this tradition in Islam, the daily certain times praying. That was actually a tradition in Christendom, in Christianity, until very recently. That's why we have church bells. We don't have church bells to sound pretty. We don't have church bells to tell us what time it is. We have church bells because they would ring 3 to 5 times a day. Yep, and call us to prayer. And all the way up to maybe like a couple hundred years ago, if not even more recent than that, that's what church bells are for. People would then build their day around the ringing of the bells, but each time the bell rang, they turned, bowed the knee, and prayed to God. 3 to 5 times a day, but then they structured their day around that. And that's where the whole idea of timekeeping from church bells comes from. That's why nowadays, all we know church bells for is every hour on the hour they ring. Because it turned into that, but the most important part of it fell away, was the praying. So I encourage you, if you ever hear church bells, stop, pray. You don't have to get down on your knees. That's preferred. But you don't have to. Stop. Say a small prayer to God. Thank him for whatever you have going on. Surrender to him whatever you have going on. And continue on with your day. You know, we're called to constantly be in prayer. The way I've always explained that is, it doesn't mean, again, down on your knees praying with your eyes closed, your palms turned up all day long. It's that constant dialogue with God in our heads. We all have that monologue, right, where we talk to ourselves all day long in our heads. We're talking through things. Don't talk to yourself. Talk to God. Bounce those things off God. Instead of having a monologue with yourself, have a dialogue with God. That's what that concept of constantly in prayer that Paul conveys to us is all about. But also, if you hear church bells, use that as a reminder. So, again, we see here, though, Daniel performing this tradition that was ingrained into Israelite culture at this point. 3 times a day, turn towards Jerusalem, towards God's temple, because that was God's dwelling place. We see this in Jonah. I will turn my face towards the Lord and send my prayers into your temple. Right? So they literally prayed towards the temple. They always faced the temple of God in Jerusalem because that was God's dwelling place. And they would pray toward it, sending their prayers to God and his dwelling place on earth. Law gets passed. Daniel knows what this law is all about. He's no fool. Right? We see this. He's a very smart man, very wise man. He bows the knee and prays. God, I know why they're doing this. I'm not going to allow manly, worldly, earthly powers to rob you of what is yours, to rob you of what I vowed to pay, to rob you what is yours and no one else is to take. And I'm going to trust you and surrender to you and give that to you in my supplication, in my prayer. Daniel, and we can, again, we'll look at this in a modern context, right? So, you can have church, but only at 15%, right? You can have church, but you can't sing, because that spreads the virus. Well, you can gather in your full congregation, but it has to be outside. Or like they tried to do in California, you just can't have church at all. Right? Daniel could have prayed with his windows closed. No one would have known. But that's not what he was supposed to do per God. He's supposed to face the temple from his window and send his prayers, his supplication, and his honoring and glorification to God. And that's what he did. And that's where today we can see a parallel there, where there are these laws being made by a largely humanistic, atheistic government body at this point, trying to rob God of what is rightfully his, the prayers and the worship from his people, and trying to do it little bits at a time, right? Daniel, you go ahead. You can go pray to God. Just close your window. Don't do it fully like you're supposed to. You guys can go and gather and worship, but only 15% capacity. And when pastors, as we talked about last week, don't do that, they are being locked up in Canada. Or John MacArthur almost got arrested. I would have loved that. John MacArthur would have loved it too. I firmly believe that John MacArthur was sitting there like, please, make me a martyr, I dare you. He knew it. He had faith in his God. He knew. That's the thing, is this humanistic, atheistic culture we live in does not understand that to a Christian, and this is how it should be, please make me a martyr. I dare you. Give me that honor. Give me that blessing. Please. It will spread the word of my God. It will expand his kingdom. Please do it. I beg you. That is the tack that we should all be taking when we come face to face with this. I'm not saying we should all go out there and seek to be persecuted, but if persecution comes to our doorstep, we should stand firmly on the foundation of Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior, knowing very well that persecution, one, will pale regardless of how horrible it is. We talked about that the other day, right? The context in which Paul was talking about persecution, right? It pales in comparison to the glories that God has and to his promises made to us, one. And two, that it will spread the church. It will reignite the church and bring life to the church. Please, arrest me for praising my God. Give me that honor. Give me that privilege. God, give me that blessing. Again, I'm not saying go out and seek persecution, but if it comes to your doorstep, if it's knocking on the front door, answer it. answer that door. Answer that door with the confidence and boldness that comes from Jesus Christ. And proclaim his gospel and glory to those very people putting the cuffs on you. Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. All right? Let's continue on here. Picking up in verse 11. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and plea before his God. Then they came near and said before the king concerning the injunction, O king, did you not sign an injunction that anyone who makes petition to any god or man within 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, the thing stands fast according to the laws of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. Then they answered and said before the king, Daniel, who is one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or the injunction you have signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. Then the king, when he heard these words, was much distressed and set his mind to deliver Daniel. So here we have a righteous leader. He realizes he's been duped. He realizes what's happening, and he realizes that it's an injustice. And he's going to work within the confines, the constraints of the laws of his land to try to be righteous, to try to deliver Daniel. And he labored till the sun went down to rescue him. Then these men came by agreement to the king and said to the king, Now, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and the Persians that no injunction or ordinance that the king establishes can be changed. Then the king commanded, and Daniel was brought and cast into the den of lions. The king declared to Daniel, May your God, whom you serve, continually deliver you. He prayed. May your God deliver you. So we see here, may your God deliver you. Can Daniel's God deliver him? I mean, we know the answer to that. But did Darius? Or is God about to once again perform another miracle to spread his gospel to the world and to also reinforce the falling away from idolatrous behaviors that the Israelites had been involved with up until this point in history? And a stone was brought and laid on the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet and with the signet of his lords, that nothing might be changed concerning Daniel. Then the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting. No diversions were brought to him, and fled from him. Then at the break of day, the king arose and went in haste to the den of lions. And as he came near to the den where Daniel was, he cried out in a tone of anguish. The king declared to Daniel, O Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to deliver you from the lions? Has your God, the living God. So here he is confessing, he is the living God. Has he delivered you? Then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. My God sent his angel and shut the lion's mouth, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him. And also before you, O king, I have done no harm. Then the king was exceedingly glad and commanded that Daniel be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no kind of harm was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. And the king commanded that those men who had maliciously accused Daniel were brought and cast into the den of lions, they, their children, and their wives. And before they reached the bottom of the den, the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces. Then King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwelled in all the earth, because he was in charge of now all the earth. Peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion people are to tremble in fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Darius prospered during the reign. So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Once again, another pagan king bowed the knee. So much so that he commanded the whole known world at this point to honor, fear, and pay reverence to the God of Israel through Daniel's obedience. And now remember, this isn't a young, spry Daniel. This is an 80, 90-year-old Daniel thrown into a den full of hungry lions. So hungry that the people that got thrown in the next morning didn't make it to the bottom. They were caught and ripped to shreds before their feet touched the ground. God works in ways that we can't always understand. Right? In retrospect, we can look back and see it here, but the Israelites couldn't see this. They can't see the future. No man can. They were falling away from God, and even at the end, they tried to come back, but they were still plagued by worship of horrific pagan practices of child sacrifice and other horrific, abominable things that God expressly forbids. He exiled them. And when he exiled them, he took this small group of people, because they weren't that big, they weren't that powerful. That's why God likes them so much. Sent them into a pagan nation where they suffered until these men that God appointed rose to prominence. And how did they do that? They didn't do it through haggling and dealing and compromising. They did it by standing firm in their faith, by trusting in God, and God used them. By standing firm no matter what stood against them, whether it was a fiery furnace, whether it was a den of lions. They stood firm. And how did God use this, right? These seems like horrible things to happen. God took his people. He cleansed his people because he got rid of all the non-believers, all the Israelites who weren't truly Israelites, as we hear in the New Testament. Just because you're circumcised doesn't mean your heart's circumcised. It doesn't make you a true Hebrew. He allowed it to cleanse that nation of the unbelief. He allowed it to cleanse that nation of the worshiping of pagan gods, because after this point, even though the Jews fell into horrible sin, they never fell again into the sin of pagan idol worship after this point in history. Once and for all, it cleansed them of it. Something that had haunted them for centuries was finally cleansed by the exile. Never again did they do it. Right? But furthermore, he furthered his kingdom. He had multiple pagan kings in multiple kingdoms put out decrees to worship and to honor and to praise the one true living God. He spread his word. And he even did a little alley-oop setup here, right? And I said this before, where did those wise men come from? How do these wise men from the east, from the area of Babylon, know about any of these Hebrew Israelite prophecies? Because of the exile. Because of prophets like Daniel. Because of other prophets that were brought there. And these prophecies were recorded in these cultures. And the wise men in these cultures then looked at them and saw a star in the sky hundreds of years later and knew what it meant. And God brought them across a great expanse, all this desert, to pay homage to the King of the world. To validate who Jesus was. It's a long game. We don't see it now. But what we do need to know is stand firm, like Daniel and his friends. And God's going to work through that and work through you to change the world and to further his kingdom. So let's take heart, men. Stand firm on the foundation of Christ every day and pay to him what we have vowed to give him, which is all of our heart, all of our mind, all of our soul, and all of our strength, every day without fail. And when we do fail, Turn to him asking for forgiveness, which he will give to you, and seek to be better today than yesterday, better tomorrow than today. Who has prayer requests?